So how many people here have heard of the Linux Foundation or know my organization at all? A few. Wow. Oh my God. It's an unusual. Clearly, I'm not at a social event. Most people I meet out and about don't know a lot about Linux, but obviously you people do. So just quickly about our organization, we host the world's largest collaborative development project, which is Linux. It's a very large project that is adopted across almost every aspect of technology. Our organization has over a decade of experience working with companies, but more broadly with sectors of the technology industry to help them solve business problems using Linux and open source. And so today what I want to do is walk through why, from the Linux Foundation's perspective, we think that Linux and open source can be helpful in the automotive sector. Some of the specific questions that people often raise, the gentleman just asked about how automotive is embracing open source, what objections there are, what type of business process change need to be made in order to adopt this software, and then I can answer any questions you have. I thought I'd start broad about why this is a good idea, and then we can go very detailed about how specifically you can leverage open source or Linux. I want to start with a pop quiz, though, and ask if anybody knows who said the following statements. Code wins arguments. Right? Anybody know? The best idea in implementation should already win. People who've seen this presentation, there's 2 people in this room at least, cannot answer the question. Sounds like something any open source developer would say on almost any mailing list that I've ever experienced over the last 20 years, right? The idea that code wins arguments, the best idea in implementation should always win. So was it this guy, Linus Torvalds, sort of this free-spirited developer who said this statement? It wasn't. It was actually Mark Zuckerberg who said it. And it was Mark Zuckerberg who said it not just casually or to his company. He said it in his letter of introduction to the Facebook IPO to their investors. This was a letter that accompanied the S1 filing of Facebook's IPO, where Mark Zuckerberg felt it was so important to explain this concept of the hacker ethos, of the idea that code should win arguments, that collaborative development was so important to Facebook that on the eve of one of the biggest IPOs in technology of the decade, this was what he chose to talk about. That's how important it is. Because when Mark Zuckerberg chose to start Facebook, he didn't go do an extensive review of which types of technology were out there, whether he used Microsoft's products or any other product out there. He just grabbed open source software and created Facebook on an entirely open source stack on commodity hardware and went on to raise $100 billion less than 10 years later. That's how important collaborative development is to the technology industry. And so having said that, I can tell you that using Linux in automotive will never work. It's just, it's too hard. In fact, Bill Gates said things like, everyone that I've ever dealt with in 10 years of doing this, in every sector of technology, in every industry, has told me the same thing. What you are doing is never going to, you don't understand, our industry is different, this is never going to work. In fact, it first started, Bill Gates, back in 2000, predicted, when you understand this crazy licensing regime, this hippie licensing regime, this GPL software, you're going to have to give away all your intellectual property. It's almost Pac-Man-like in nature. And when I saw this quote, I couldn't figure out quite what Bill Gates was talking about, because I grew up in the 80s. I don't know if many of you did. I played a lot of Pac-Man. I was like, what is he talking about, Pac-Man-like nature? And then I finally figured it out. He saw a market forecast chart for Linux software. And that has actually turned out to be true today. Today, Linux is dominating in almost every single sector of technology. It's #1 in server side. It's #1 in embedded systems. It's #1 in mobile devices. It's 90% share in high-performance computing systems. It runs 90% of Wall Street's trading platforms. It is one of the most prolific software platforms in the world. In fact, this is just how powerful this type of development is and how you can leverage this type of power. 10,923, 547. That's the number of lines of code that are added to Linux and subtracted to Linux every day, every single day. There are over 8 changes to Linux an hour. Every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It is the fastest paced, biggest collaborative development effort in the history of computing. The worth of this collective R&D is over $10 billion. There are over 3 million lines of code that were added to Linux just in the last year and a half. It is a tremendous, tremendous code base that you can lever that supports more silicon architectures, supports more devices, supports more forms of computing than any platform in the history of computing. And the business numbers bear that out. 850,000. This number has actually gone up to 900,000. That's the number of Linux smartphones that are activated daily. 90% of the high-performance computing market, 700,000 televisions sold every day running Linux. $1,000 trillion. In fact, I can't even read that number. That's the amount of money that's transacted on just one Linux system, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. In fact, Linux runs the entire global financial trading system. The Tokyo Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange. 90% of the world's equities trading platforms run Linux. But Linux has done more than just create a huge value in the code that it's created, huge business value, the people who adopt it and use it in their industry. It's created an entire ethos. An ethos that is singular in its concept in terms of its simplicity, but vast in its impact on humanity. And that is that idea that all of us are smarter than any one of us. And Linux is sort of the existing proof that that type of collaborative development can work, but it's now being adopted in the pharmaceutical industry, in the mining industry, and in other industries where they're sharing information in order to accelerate the pace of innovation and advance their businesses and entire sectors of business. And so that's sort of why Linux is important and is something that can be leveraged in the automotive industry as well. But I want to talk about sort of some of the dynamics that we're seeing outside of the automotive industry that may influence this sector of technology in a meaningful way. And the first message I would give you today, which I think you all understand since you've heard of the Linux Foundation, you're probably a lot of software people in this room, is the automotive industry must get good at software. And I'm going to be a jerk and I'm going to lecture, but it's something that is clear. I just saw in the keynote this morning, user preference is increasingly being driven by the idea of being able to personalize a car, do navigation effectively. These are things that are driving consumer behavior that are going to impact the automotive industry. And I think you're all well aware of that. And I think you're all well aware of the competition that's coming from the consumer electronics industry, the idea that you can bring a smartphone into a car and use that to, in fact, replace many of the functionalities that you would find in a traditional IVI or head unit. And so if your software is this, that's going to be tough. I think all of you saw the announcement this week from Apple that they're now integrating voice navigation into the iPhone platform. That's going to be integrated into automotive components in many cars. And these guys are stiff competition. They're very good at software. They're very good at innovating. What's worse is when you combine this with this, it has a devastating effect on the automotive industry because it looks like this. And one of the higher margin components within a car starts to get replaced by something that's completely outside of the automotive sector. I think you're all well aware of this. I don't need to belabor the point. But what we find from one technology sector to another is that adjacent sectors can create competition that needs a response. And clearly the automotive industry is responding, and I think responding in a positive way with initiatives like Genevi and with increasing the value and the complexity and all of the things around the software stack within a car. Because software is really driving most of the value in technology these days. The consumer electronics industry hasn't always been saints either, right? Even though they're giving some competitive pressure to the automotive industry, they've had their problems as well. If you look at a lot of consumer electronic companies, Sony is a good example, most of their value in the past was hardware driven as well. You had elegant device form factors, telephones, were simply used to make voice phone calls, and the software stacks in those consumer devices weren't very sophisticated. So hardware design was important, and that's what people really focused on, and that has radically changed. And I'll give you an example of how that's working in consumer electronics. Does anybody know which of these phones is which? So you can recognize one, maybe two, right? Normally I speak to much geekier crowds, and so they can pretty much get them, which drives me nuts when I'm trying to make this point. But you get the idea, right? These are pretty similar in form factor. They're basically just large screens. It's not till you turn them on that you can actually tell which phone is which. One is an iPhone, one's a Windows phone, one's a BlackBerry, a couple of Android phones in there. The point is that the software is what is driving the experience and the value for these type of consumer devices. It is going to be no different in the automotive industry. Again, I think most of you are all aware of that, and it's an important trend for you to understand. Even the enterprise software, traditional IT, is starting to abstract hardware, starting to make hardware less relevant, and really software is becoming the core of the entire industry. This is the idea of cloud computing, of software as a service, of app stores, of hosted services like Google Apps and all of the Google services that you rely on every day. Hosted software like Salesforce.com that's simply delivered through a web browser over the internet, can be on any screen, anywhere, anytime. That's where the IT industry is moving, towards a software-centric services business that has customers using software across a variety of form factors and modalities. I think that will impact the automotive industry, and I know that's something you're all preparing for. What's tough about this software-driven industry is that it creates some price pressure on innovation that you are all going to face if you're not immediately facing it right now. I think Steve referenced this in his presentation earlier, but I want to walk through it because I think it's relevant to this crowd, which is, this is what sort of this is more of a consumer electronics example, but it's something that I think all of you can relate to in the automotive industry, which is when the CE industry used to develop hardware, they had a lower set of internal development costs because, again, they didn't have as much software in their stacks, which is very expensive and complicated to make. And they had a lot of revenue in terms of time in the market. You know, most people, I think Steve mentioned, you know, most people replace their smartphones once a year. Used to be, you know, every 4 years or so people would replace it. The technology cycles are so fast, consumers are so fickle right now that what's happening is you have less time in the market to sell your stuff, and the cost of developing it has gone significantly higher because, you know, those screens, the software underneath them take vast oceans of people to create. Again, you know, look at how much work goes into just Linux itself. 10,000 lines of code a day added, 5,000 subtracted, millions of lines every year, billions of dollars in investment. It's a huge increase in internal development costs if you're going to do it on your own, and you have less time to make money, so you're pretty much doomed. However, what most industries are now doing is collaborating in order to save on internal development costs. This is why people use open source. It's not because they just, you know, they want to share code. It's because it saves them time and money. It allows them to make better products faster and cheaper because they're leveraging a common code base and then adding their value on top of that. What that does is it reduces your internal development costs and adds opportunity. The opportunity part is interesting. The opportunity part comes from the fact that open source code allows you to own your own intellectual property. When you own your own intellectual property, when you own the platform, when you're not licensing it from a third party like Microsoft or Apple, you can create your own app stores, your own service revenue streams on top of that software. That's why open source as a licensing regime is so effective, is because you actually get to own that IP as opposed to licensing it from some third party. And that gives you real opportunity. So lower cost, more revenue opportunity. This is why the consumer electronics industry, the telecommunications industry, Wall Street, high performance, that's why all these folks are turning to open source and Linux. And so if you're figuring out better, faster ways to create software, and you want to be good at software, you really got to be good at open source, right? And this is one where people will ask questions, and I think the gentleman previously asked, well, what is the automotive industry saying about open source? Why do you have to use open source? Some companies are successful that create proprietary software and use closed stacks. And, this open source stuff, maybe you're just the Linux Foundation guy. It's not as great as you might think. But I'd like you to think about it in a different way, which is the most successful technology companies in the world, and I would argue the most successful companies in the world, are great at open source. Can anybody here guess one of the best companies in terms of using open source? What that company might be? IBM. IBM, good guess. No, you're wrong. Anybody else? Apple. It's Apple. It's Apple. And people are like, wait a second, Apple, that's the most closed, proprietary, silicon to software company in the world. They make their own chips, they make their own hardware, they make their own software. They lock everybody into their app store, they approve every single app, yeah, you're hooked into their iCloud. If Apple is the most successful company using open source, we're not seeing it. Well, let me show you where it is. Does anybody here have an iPhone? Anybody? Yeah, get a Linux phone. But go into your iPhone and do this for me. Go into Settings, go to General, go to About, and check out the legal notices inside of your iPhone. And here is what you will find. You will find oodles of open source software. You will find the GPL license inside of your iPhone. Every single iPhone sold. You will find a name like Theodore Cho. He's a Linux Foundation fellow. Much of his code is in your iPhone. You will see the name Linux in there. The kernel isn't actually in the iPhone, but lots and lots of the software that's in every Linux implementation is actually in your iPhone as well. Apple uses huge amounts of open source software to build every single product they make. And Apple's very good at it. They're core contributors to projects like WebKit, to projects like LLVM, which is toolchain technology, to major broad-scale open source projects that they participate in every day, and they're very effective at it. But Apple doesn't even stop there. Does anybody know how much cash Apple's forecasted to have next year, next fall? They have like $110 billion today. By next September, they're forecast to have $200 billion in cash. Stunning. That's enough money to buy HP, Intel, and Dell combined and still have change. It's stunning. And what is Apple going out and buying? They don't really buy much. They don't do a lot of M&A activity. But one M&A activity that they did do was they bought an open source project. Weird, right? Why would Apple care so much about open source that they'd use a little bit of their cash to go actually purchase an open source project? They bought this project, CUPS. CUPS is the printing subsystem that Linux uses. It's the printing subsystem that's in every iPhone, iPad, and Mac device that you use to print stuff out to any printer you want. And it's licensed under the GPL license. Continues to be an open source project. The developer who's the maintainer, Michael Sweet, is an Apple employee. And Apple felt that open source was important enough to them that they use it in their products, participate in the community that creates the software, and they actually go out and do M&A activity to purchase open source projects. It's almost unheard of. So the point being is, if software is going to define your industry and impact customer choice, you want to be good at software and do it in a better, faster, cheaper way, get good at open source because your competition is definitely doing that. And this is sort of the last series of points I want to make to you. And I'm not trying to pick on the automotive sector, but I do want to say I've been to so many different industry events in different sectors of all form of industry, and everybody tells me the same thing. We are totally unique. Jim, you just don't understand how difficult it is for us to adopt this technology, this open source stuff. You just don't understand. And I'll give you some, I've heard it from, You don't understand, intellectual property in this industry is really tough. Lives are on the line. People are driving their cars. We can't use this type of software in a car. You can't believe, you don't understand we have to support these cars. They last 30 years. You don't understand, we have 3-year production cycles. You don't understand. I've heard this from every sector of almost every industry out there. Global financial system could never use open source. Jim, you don't understand, there are trillions of dollars of transactions that are on the line every single day. If there's a hiccup, we could have a global economic meltdown. How could we ever use this Linux stuff? And we don't want to give away our intellectual property. We're not going to open up our proprietary trading algorithms. We make billions of dollars on this stuff. Well, guess what? About 3 weeks ago, I actually rang the bell on Wall Street. It runs the global financial services trading platform. In fact, Wall Street now loves open source so much, the New York Stock Exchange hosts an open source project at the Linux Foundation. They open source their high-frequency trading algorithms, not the algorithms, the middleware APIs, in order to collaborate with their competitors to take non-differentiating software and make it better, faster, cheaper. The New York Stock Exchange, the bastion of Wall Street, actually shares their source code. That's about all they share, but they do share their source code. The military could never use open source. People will be killed, literally. This is too important. Our bidding cycles are too hard. Government certifications are too hard to achieve. Yet, Linux runs unmanned aerial drones, nuclear submarines, defense coordination systems. It's really everywhere. They were able to overcome it because the business value of using this code was so compelling. The telecommunications industry could never. Jim, you don't understand what 5 nines of availability means. I mean, the requirements for telecommunications is just way too hard. That's what I heard 10 years ago when Solaris and Unix really dominated the telecom switching equipment market. Now, Linux dominates it with almost 80% share, has essentially kicked out the competition of that market in general. The mobile device industry could never use it. However, 900,000 Linux smartphones are now activated on a daily basis. I think you get the point. And here's the point I want to make to you guys, and I can go into great detail on this, but I think it's an important concept for everyone to understand, which is using open source doesn't mean you got to give away your intellectual property. You don't have to open source everything. What you need to do is this. Leverage the parts you want, create a business process so that you understand what code you're consuming from the open source projects that can benefit your business, understand how that code interacts with other software so that you can keep the stuff you want to keep closed, and open the stuff you want to keep open. It's a simple business process of understanding how the licensing works, how those licenses interact with other software, and then setting up a business process so that when you develop products and release them as a commercial product, you comply with the licenses and you keep what you want and you give away what you don't need to do. And that you collaborate where you want to and you keep when you don't. It's a super simple process. John here has oodles of experience doing that. The Linux Foundation has training courses. There are lots of resources out there that can teach you how to do this. But that's what it is. It's not some funky intellectual property regime that's going to have you open source all the intellectual property you ever had. It's just a simple change management that you have to undergo in order to take advantage of billions of dollars of free R&D that you can leverage for your business. Then the second to last point I want to leave you with is there's no reason to fear open source. Open source is not going to commoditize anybody's pre-existing business. It's just going to raise the innovation bar. You're not going to be able to sit around and just do nothing and have business as usual. But it's not open source that's going to cause that. It's the iPad and Velcro that's causing that, right? Open source is just something that's going to help you respond to it. The best industry's use of open source, IBM I think is a terrific example of this, is they're perfectly willing to cannibalize an existing product by knowing when something is just really become a commodity, collaborating with their competitors through open source on that, and then increasing their innovation bar by providing higher level value. through user interface, through business intelligence algorithms, things like that. But, kernel software, middleware, some of these things they're perfectly happy to cannibalize and share. And so that's what's going to happen, I think, for the automotive sector, is that the innovation bar will simply go up. And people who don't understand that are going to have a tough time. And you can either be at the table understanding how to use this to make better products faster, cheaper, be at the table, or you can be on the menu because your competitors are going to do this anyways. And then finally, the last thought I want to leave you with in terms of the best way to leverage this open source technology and what you need to think about is to think fairly broadly in software. From not only how to use open source to create the head unit client itself, but think all the way to the cloud as well. Because if you want to get apps into a car, it's not a matter of just taking a bunch of open source code, adding your proprietary HMI interfaces on it, and then throwing it in a car. You have to now have a connected vehicle that requires identity management, software provisioning, application delivery, compatibility testing, a wide variety of things that you see Android, Apple doing today that are actually very hard and require a fairly complicated set of software interactions and supply chains to deliver. And so if you're not thinking about it already, I suspect most of you are, you should definitely start thinking about it now because it's beyond just the client. You have to think all the way out to the cloud infrastructure that hosts this stuff. And so that's all I wanted to talk to you about today. I can go into detail about anything the Linux Foundation does. We actually host two of the projects Steve mentioned, the Yocto project and Tizen, which are implementations of Genevi, and do lots of other stuff for all sorts of industry. So I think I have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'm happy to take as many as you want.
Yeah, just a quick question. You put up a number of books there. Which book makes the most compelling case if you were to advise the auto industry to read one of those books? Which makes the most compelling case for open source as a business model in the automotive community?
I think Open Innovation by Henry Cheeseborough is a good book. I enjoy that read. There's Invisible Engines is a book on how platform technology works. There's Wikinomics is one. I'm only pitching that book because I'm in it. There's a good variety of them. If anyone wants to email me at jim@linux.com, I can provide lots of resources and recommend some other good reads for you.
Some of those books are actually also listed on linux.com, Foundation Linux.
Yeah, there's linux.com, one of the web properties we manage, has a resource list of books. And there's lots of good white papers out there as well. It depends. If you're trying to explain to a business executive why this is something you might want to leverage, then I think open innovations, things like that is important. If you're working with your legal department, helping them understand the intellectual property regimes, then I think we actually have some just good white papers on the Linux Foundation website that can help you with understanding just the basics of those licensing regimes and the business processes that are required to support them. So there's lots of resources out there. Yep.
So I'm Dave Anderson from NVIDIA, and I have a question just when you were speaking about Apple. And forgive me if this is a basic question, but what does it mean when you purchase an open source project? And what legal implications does that have? Does that have restrictions?
Is NVIDIA thinking of buying an open source? You can't buy Linux. We're not for sale. Yeah, exactly. Congrats, by the way, on the Retina display win. I thought that was a great design win for you guys. So what it means to buy an open source project is that you actually buy the copyright to the code. So Michael Sweet, who maintained CUPS, actually had people who contributed to that project assign the copyright ownership to his company. And so when Apple purchased that, they were purchasing the copyright under the GPL license. And so what that does is when you own the copyright, you as the copyright holder choose which license you want to license it under. They could have continue to license it under the GPL, which they chose doing. Anything that had previously been released under that would continue to be released under a GPL license. But they also could have chosen to license it in any other way that they want because they actually owned the copyright for subsequent components that they did. But the main thing to understand is that they were buying the copyright there. And I suspect because these printer software guys are so rare, They just wanted to hire this guy as well, the guy Michael Sweet, who ran Cubs. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned Apple, especially that they use open source, but that from the outside they don't look very open source.
Sure.
Are you worried that with the automotive industry, everyone signs up and says, yeah, we'd love to use open source, we'd love to get as much free stuff as we can,
Yeah.
but isn't really willing to contribute?
No, I don't care. I don't care if you contribute or not. I mean, here's the thing, you know, everyone says that same thing at the beginning. They're like, well, you know, we just want to take all this stuff and we're not going to contribute back. And, you know, in the past, open source developers would get upset and say, you greedy car makers, we knew it all the time. You're taking all our code and not giving it back. The thing that's happened over time is that, no one talks about that anymore because really it's in your business interest to give back to these projects as you start using it in a meaningful way in products. Let me give you a specific example of what I mean by that. So NVIDIA or any other chip company, when they're bringing up a product, they'll start actually submitting their code to the Linux kernel while they're in the development phase, before they've even released a commercial product to the world. The reason they do that is they want their code to be in the main project. They don't want to suck in the code, make a bunch of changes, and then not contribute them back, because if they did that, now you're on the hook to support those changes over a long period of time. And the whole reason you got into open source, which is to collaborate and share and lower cost, gets defeated because now you're screwed. You're just maintaining your own software. But the thing I would say about giving back to these projects, it's actually a fairly straightforward process. And in particular for things like driver support, it's not that hard to get that accepted into the upstream projects. If it's written in a way that doesn't break other code and is written in a way that's not totally idiotic, you can generally get it done. And there's a lot of idiotic code that actually does try and get into it. It's just, I think people are getting better, and there's a group of developers out there who are hireable, who are better at actually getting that stuff into the main projects. John.
I'm just going to make a comment. For those of you who haven't read it, I think you should. Jim and the team publish a report every year called Who Contributes or Who Writes Linux. Notable this year, Microsoft in the top 20 as contributors to the Linux kernel, and it's for that exact reason, is that they want to work with Azure and others, and they're beginning to recognize that, hey, guess what? If I want Wall Street to actually start using cloud services for me, I got to give them some hooks and whatnot to input. So for the first time ever, Microsoft is on the list and actually in the top 20.
Yeah, you're just not going to keep up with the pace. 10,000 lines of code a day, 5,000 straight. You can't keep up. And so generally people give back just as a business decision, not necessarily as a, motherhood and apple pie decision. John.
I was going to try to ask this question to Steve, but if you have a patch that you want to submit to a project, and maybe it's kind of time critical for your goals, and maybe it's Geneva, if the maintainer goes off the grid, abandons the project, what happens? Picks up the slack. Does it ever happen?
So the question is, if you have a product that you're trying to release and you want that code that you're using in your product to be in the upstream project that you're pulling the code from, you want them to accept it, and the maintainer is reluctant to do that.
No, the maintainer's gone.
The maintainer's gone. Yeah, well, first of all, don't pick projects that have flaky maintainers. That's the first. No, I mean, but really, companies, they do the analysis. They look at the projects. They look at the release schedules. They look at how important that code is to them. They look at the maintainer. They look at their ability to leverage that, and they make a business decision based on that. And so Linux, as an example, is a pretty easy one. The kernel gets released every 3 months. It's been released like that for the past 15 years. There's a very consistent development process with a very well-known, professionalized set of maintainers that people interact with very effectively. There may be other projects that you think are good that may not have that similar type of ilk, but what's happening in the breadth of open source projects is that they're really becoming professionalized. And so when you're pulling from WebKit or Bluesy or a lot of these things, there's generally a fairly reasonable maintainer. The important part of how do you meet your business deadline for releasing a product with staging code and getting it into an upstream project is to start early. Linux kernel maintainers, for example, will work under an NDA. In fact, the Linux Foundation will even back them by signing up sort of a three-way NDA with commercial companies and kernel maintainers so that you can actually get your code staged into some of the trees privately without giving away what your product might be. And then when the product is released, the code right away gets accepted into the kernel. And so the idea is when you're in the development stage and the bring up stage to get working on that code early. This is what IBM, Intel, all the big, Apple, all these companies generally, that's their business practice, the best companies. I got two more over here and then I'll come back. Yeah.
I'll make mine real brief here. Big fan of Unix and Linux and all those applications. However, there are a lot of applications within vehicles that require deterministic response.
Yeah.
And there's some things, that if something fails, can kill people.
Yeah.
And the liability issues associated with that are tremendous, which is why you don't see a lot of general purpose operating systems and brake systems and
Yeah.
control and things like that.
And the kill people argument, I'm a little less, doesn't sway me that much. But if there's just a footprint that just can't handle this type of code, don't use it.
What is Linux doing anything to address the ISO 26262?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in that particular area, so there may be, but I can find an answer for you. Shoot me an email and I'll get you an answer to that. Jim@linux.com. That's the best part about owning Linux.com. I get Jim@linux.com. Yeah.
Can you speak to your co-opetition with HTML5?
Oh, HTML5 is the best thing ever happened to Linux, right? Because the more you're abstracting from the hardware, the more the free guy wins, right? The more you're starting to abstract technical layers, the better it is for open source. So HTML5, I think, is very compelling. I know that a lot of the hardware interface APIs still need to be defined. That's happening very, very rapidly. What I would do if you're looking at building an application framework in vehicles is looking at how you can balance some native requirements with HTML5 as sort of for your more basic application framework. Because what HTML5 gets you is on as many screens as possible at the lowest porting cost. It's not the end-all be-all today, but I mean obviously for Linux, which is on every kind of screen form factor from fridges to TVs to mobile devices, HTML5 is a terrific platform because it's an alternative to the Apple Objective-C APIs and the Windows Win API. So it's great for Linux. I mean, I'm a huge fan of HTML5. Yep.
If I'm not mistaken, SpaceX used open source software in their Dragon spacecraft in their line. I mean, I was very impressed. That was a very impressive performance for a commercial company to do something that only a few governments have did.
Yeah.
So their holdup, I think, was the software reliability, and they seem to have got that down.
Yeah.
It was a very impressive performance for open source. So
Yeah. The holdup wasn't my fault, but Aerospace and Defense have actually been using Linux for quite some time. Again, I think the misconception is that people are just grabbing this code from the kernel.org website and throwing it into a rocket ship. That's what generally actually happens is the code comes from those projects. That's the well from which that stuff springs. But there's a clear supply chain of integrators, support ecosystem that backs that up, which is why open source really isn't harmful to businesses. If I was working as a software company providing head unit software, I'd really be focused on application services, on app store infrastructure. That's the harder stuff. It's stickier. It actually would live across automotive model lifespans as opposed to just being in one particular model year. And actually would increase your revenue opportunity rather than cannibalize your existing revenue itself. So but there's a whole supply chain that's implemented in those aerospace and defense implementations of open source. Question?
I had a question. I guess what has happened to address like the determinism issue, and I mean, what has changed about Linux that makes that better? And
Yep.
is there any kind of a book or something that talks about that? And then the other question is for automotive uses, we have certain communication protocols we use. Is there anything being done to address that?
There are. So the question was, how are you handling determinism, and then some of the unique automotive interfaces that are being used here. We have a report called the Linux Weather Forecast on the Linux Foundation website that addresses some of the trends that are going on in the kernel community in particular relative to those topics, and I would refer you to those. Also shoot me an email and I can get you in touch directly with the people who are working on that. Generally, what happens at a lot of our Linux Foundation events is it's a place where people come together and would work on those particular problems. Companies who come together at these events and say, we want to do a session on this particular technical topic because we have this business problem that's important to our industry. And what you'll end up finding a lot of times are sort of fellow travelers either within your sector of industry or across sectors. I'll give you one example. Because I'm not going to be able to answer your specific question on the technical trend, I want to refer you to that paper, but give you an example of how the collaboration might work. Power management has typically been a big issue for the mobile device industry. It's actually a huge issue for the data center IT operations world as well. At a few of our events, folks who are running massive scale-out data centers like Google and Facebook, where power and cooling really is their primary cost, got together with mobile folks where battery life is their primary concern, and actually really worked together to address this issue of power management and making it better in Linux. And so for determinism and other things like that, you'll find, and look at that weather forecast that we publish. It'll show you who's working on it, where they're from, and really help you understand where the kernel is going on.
Determinism are being driven by the high-frequency trader desks.
Yeah.
So most of the deterministic aspects are being brought in from those guys, which is what you were commenting earlier.
Right. So the high-frequency trading guys care about determinism as well, and so that's going to benefit you. It's sort of this cross-pollination across different technology sectors. That's a, terrific consequence of this type of development.
Also real-time extensions, it's like kernel.
Yep.
For
Yeah. So, and Mentor Graphics, the sponsor of this event, I think has a deep bench of expertise on some of the real-time extensions to Linux.
So it'll do a lot better than the stack kernel, but something complicated also stuff, it should be open or something.
Okay. All right, I'm getting the hook in the back. If there are any other questions, again, it's just jim@linux.com. Quick plug for my man, Linus Torvalds, who works at the Linux Foundation. He won the Millennium Prize in Finland yesterday. It's one of the most prestigious awards in technology. So Linux is on a tear. I hope the automotive industry can use it as well. Thank you.